Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Carrese, welcoming you to Raise the Line from Elsevier, an ongoing exploration of how to improve health and healthcare. Today, we're happy to welcome Shannon Watts to the podcast. She's a leading force in organizing and mobilizing women to create political, electoral, and cultural change in the United States. A former communications executive turned movement builder, Shannon founded Moms Demand Action in response to the Sandy Hook tragedy in 2012, growing it into one of the largest grassroots organizations in the country, mobilizing volunteers to push for stronger gun safety laws. Recognized as one of Time's 100 most influential people and a Forbes 50 over 50 changemaker, among many other honors, she's also the author of Fight Like a Mother, How a Grassroots Movement Took on the Gun Lobby and Why Women Will Change the World, and her 2025 New York Times and USA Today bestseller, Fired Up, which explores how women can harness their ambition and agency at any stage of life. That book led to the creation of Firestarter University, a program designed to help women explore their dormant desires and transform their lives, and Bonfire Communities, in-person gatherings across the country to help women tap into their political, professional, and personal power. And Shannon Watts, thanks so much for being with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
So we always like to start with learning more about our guests. And before you became an activist, you were a VP and communications exec for Fortune 500 companies and then a stay-at-home mom of 5. So what was your journey toward activism?
I had never been politically involved at all, really, except to donate to small dollars to a few candidates. But I certainly didn't understand how the legislative system worked. But I was at home, as you said, it was during a 5-year period when I was staying home to take care of my kids. They were middle school to college. And I was folding laundry and I had the television on in the background. And I looked over and there was a breaking news chyron that there was an active shooter inside an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, a place I'd never heard of. And like so many other people that day, I just sort of stopped what I was doing and sat on the side of my bed and just watched this horrific tragedy unfold, right? That 20 children and 6 educators were slaughtered in the sanctity of an American elementary school. And I was devastated and in tears. And at some point in the middle of the night, that sadness turned into just abject rage. So when I woke up the next day, even though I was not knowledgeable about politics or organizing or even gun violence, I had grown up in the 1980s when Mothers Against Drunk Driving was so influential and made such a significant change legislatively, culturally. And I thought there needs to be a group of moms who takes on the gun lobby the same way they took on the alcohol lobby. Not thinking that person was me. Just thinking, oh, I'll go join that. And I looked online and I couldn't find anything at all, right? It was mostly think tanks run by men in Washington, D.C., or smaller disconnected organizations, also mostly run by men in cities and states. And I just thought, I want to be part of a badass army of women. That's who gets stuff done in this country. I had 75 Facebook friends at the time. I was not exactly a social media phenomenon. But I just put this clarion call out into the zeitgeist on a new Facebook page. But what happened was that my 75 friends shared it with their friends and on and on. It was actually one of the first things that became truly viral on Facebook. And that was the beginning of my political career.
Wow. So totally an unexpected turn for you.
Yes.
And, for the younger folks in our audience, Sandy Hook was a real landmark, I think, except for probably the Columbine shooting. After that, it was the biggest sort of moment when the country was riveted on gun violence.
Yes.
So thinking back to that time, I can see how the iron was hot and ready for somebody to strike. Yeah. So that must have been a wild adventure to all of a sudden start creating this national organization. And why don't you talk us through a little bit about, you had some big wins, obviously, but I'm sure there was a bumpy ride too. So talk to us about both ends of that.
Well, I think it's important to understand that there is a fine line between naivete and stupidity. And I was definitely straddling that line. Thankfully, I didn't know what awaited me when I started this Facebook page. First of all, the threats of death and sexual violence to me and to my kids began immediately. I never imagined I'd be a public figure, so my address and my phone number and my email, everything was publicly available. And people were coming to my house. They were sending me texts. They were DMing me. It was just nonstop. And certainly in those early days, that gave me pause, subjecting my family to something that is unsafe.
Sure.
And I've talked about the fact that it was a suburban mom, right? So I thought, oh, I'll just call the local police department and they'll keep an eye on the house in the neighborhood. I'll explain what's going on and they'll be helpful. And this was Indiana. They sent an officer out to my home and I told him what was going on. He said, well, ma'am, that's what you get when you mess with the Second Amendment.
Whoa.
And it was very much in that moment that I realized, okay, I either need to back down or double down. There's sort of no fine line here. And I just have a personality that I double down. And also, look, if I lose my kids, I have nothing left to lose. I think we all felt very much like our kids were in danger after that horrific shooting tragedy. And then the other thing I realized very early on was, first of all, that we would need a funding partner. And I was grateful to find Mayor Mike Bloomberg, former mayor, who invested a lot of money in our organization and really helped turbocharge what we were doing. We didn't really change much about our brand or our strategy, but that money was crucial to allowing me to pay the people who'd been volunteering. But also, what I could tell was, when you take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that ever has existed, you are going to lose a lot. And I didn't want to lose volunteers who felt like it was a waste of their time. And so part of the culture became this idea of, is Babe Ruth who said, you can't beat the person who never gives up. If we just kept going, which a lot of women had tattooed on their bodies, this keep going motto, and also losing forward, which is just the idea that you're going to lose a lot of battles on the way to winning the war. So maybe you lost this particular legislative battle, but you now have more relationships with new lawmakers. You grew your chapter. You learned something so that you could win the next time. And that happened over and over again. And that, I really think, was the secret to retaining volunteers. It's not hard to get people to come into the organization after a shooting tragedy or after their kid has gone through a lockdown drill. It is hard to get them to show up year after year and selflessly donate their time and talent. And so I think the difficulty became, how do we make sure we retain volunteers? And I think another part of that formula is joy. It can't just all be heavy, sad, tragic. People need joy. And just to give you an example, we decided early on we would have this annual meeting where we brought leadership in. It started out as like 60 people, and now it's thousands and thousands of people, and there's a wait list. But I said, let's have a dance party at the end of this weekend. We're going to be hearing all these stories. We're going to be hearing from gun violence survivors. We're going to be talking about heavy stuff. And people were like, oh my God, that's not appropriate. That's not. And I was adamant. And it was so popular. Like, women went to the hospital with dancing injuries. That's how the dancing was going. And everyone on the questionnaire said, I will come back because of the dance party at the end. Right. So I think joy is something we sometimes miss as organizers too.
That's interesting. What was your biggest win in those early years?
Well, in the early years, it was just creating the credibility and the sense that there was an opposing force to the gun lobby. Because remember, back in 2012, a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. Democrats. So senators like Mark Warner, who had an A rating, were voting with the gun lobby. And we had to convince them that these women who were showing up at their fundraisers, at hearings, in district offices, that those women had the power to either, have their back or have their job. We had to convince them of that. And we did do that. Mark Warner now has an F rating, and, he's a very big fan of Moms Demand Action. But I think in the early days, that was the heavy and hard part. What I'm most proud of, not only just passing 500 gun laws, getting 500 restaurants and retailers to stop allowing open carry in their stores, electing hundreds of our own candidates to office, including 3 members of Congress, the new Virginia governor. We passed the first federal gun safety legislation in a generation, and with the help of 15 Republican senators, which everyone said, that we had a snowball's chance in hell of doing. But what happened was, after the shootings in Buffalo at a grocery store by a white supremacist, and in Uvalde, yet another elementary school by a man with an AR-15, the nation was so angry, and we're certain that what happened was that Mitch McConnell saw polling that said, if Republicans vote against the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was spearheaded by President Biden, there would be a price to pay at the midterm elections. And that's how we were, of course, we had marches and rallies, and there was so much work to get that over the finish line. But that happened in 2022, a decade in, and it was a seismic shift in American politics.
Yes, that was definitely a landmark moment of a better sort, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So you take all of this amazing experience and all of these lessons, and you shift into empowering other women to do similar things. I mean, not at that scale, but making a shift in their life and getting engaged in a different way than they were before. And you came up with what you call the FIRE formula. Tell us about that.
When I started Moms Demand Action, I was 41 years old. And within the 5 years or so before it, I had gone through a major metamorphosis in my life. I had stepped out of a marriage that I had gotten into that was not working. I was in a career that didn't light me up and I wasn't happy. I really took those 5 years to just figure out, like, who am I and what is it that I want to do? And I ended up remarrying and trying new things. And by the time Moms Demand Action happened, I had a very good sense of who I was, in terms of what are my values, what are my abilities, and what are my desires. And it really wasn't until I had the hindsight to realize when you practice bringing those things together over and over again, and first of all, you have to know what they are. That is how I use the metaphor living on fire, which is really just a way of looking at, like, what's limiting you and what's calling you. And then I saw so many thousands and thousands of women come into the organization and do the exact same thing, but in a different way, because we all have different values, abilities, and desires. So back in 2012, my values, I had little kids. It was keeping my family and my community safe. My abilities were this decades-long career in corporate communications. I knew how to build a brand. I knew how to tell a story. And my desire, as I said, was to stand shoulder to shoulder with a badass army of women. And I had just sort of made this happen through sheer willpower of using that formula. But other women would come in and had different values, abilities, and desires, and I saw them thrive and do different things, whether it was leaving a relationship that no longer served them, or asking for a promotion, or going back to school, starting their own organization in their city or state. And it just occurred to me that this is a practice and that there's a formula for this, and that we can all be trying this in our lives. And then there are these things that hold us back. For women, it's mostly, guilt and shame that's put on us by society, and then we internalize it, right? In my book, Fired Up, How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age, I interviewed over 70 women. And I just threw this question in there. I asked them all, what are you worried your deathbed regret will be? And I was certain they would all say what the most common deathbed regret in the world is, which is that I lived a life that wasn't true to me. None of them said that. Not one of them. They were moms. They all said that I will pursue what I want at the expense of my children, which is really fascinating, because I can tell you that's nothing I've ever heard from my husband before, because he figures if he pursues what's important to him, it's good for everybody.
So this
right?
This was their regret that they would have.
They were worried that would be their deathbed regret, that they pursued something that was important to them at the expense of their kids.
Okay.
These are state lawmakers. These are people like Maria Shriver. Right? These are women who are doing amazing, important things, and yet they're sort of like saddled with that burden. And I just think it's really important that women realize, especially my generation, we are the wealthiest, healthiest generation that's ever existed. When we turn 50, we have a whole nother chapter to live, unlike our moms. And I just want women to make the best use of that time.
One of the things that's underlying this is a sense of passion about something, finding the passion and pursuing it. You write that women often mistake passion for other things. So what are those things?
Yes. And staying with the fire metaphor, I call them false fires. There are these ideas that we bring in and take in from being very little. These shoulds. We should stay small physically. We should stay at home with our kids. We should take on the majority of the caretaking. There are all these shoulds that we start to believe are fulfillment. For me, it was busyness, right? That, if I were more productive, then I will find my purpose. That is my purpose, just constantly being busy and helping other people. For others, it's happiness, this idea that you have this ephemeral feeling, that is going to somehow become permanent. There's so many different ways to look at the shoulds that somehow become our fulfillment. And going back to that example of, women feeling like they will pursue what they want at the expense of their kids, we don't really, as women, ask ourselves often, what do I want? And it's not because we're weak, it's because we are wise. We see all these obstacles in front of us, all of these shoulds, all of these burdens that we have. And we realize it's better to just keep our heads down and keep doing those things. And like, imagine what if every woman asked themselves every day, what do I want? Governments would topple, family systems would fall apart, institutions would fail. Like, we know what would happen if women didn't keep doing all the things they should, or they think they should be doing. And I just want women to make space for the desire, for the wants, for the needs, and to ask themselves, what do I want? Often that doesn't happen until later in life. I think it would be great if it was a way of life that we started when we were young. I interview a lot of women in the book who, and it's interesting, particularly women who are the daughters of immigrants, they are expected to go down a very specific path: doctor, engineer, lawyer. You have these specific paths you can go down, and then they go down them and they realize, this is not for me. This is not what I want to be doing. And then you sort of have to backtrack and start all over again. But it also isn't too late. There's always this idea that, it's too late. I can't start something new. I just talked to a woman who is running for office where I live in Florida, who during COVID went back to law school at age 56 and got her degree and is now running for Congress.
Wow.
It's just not too late.
So, one of the things you also talk about is how women can sort of advance themselves in a new pursuit by finding like-minded women. And I mentioned in the introduction the bonfire idea. So help our listeners understand, what are some steps you can take toward finding those people and building that community?
Yes. I am an introvert. As an only child, I have always been, as I mentioned, busy and focused on my career and my family. And I didn't make a ton of room for friends, which are much, much harder to make as you get older. And yes, during Moms Demand Action, I had this whole bonfire, I call it, of women who shared my values and wanted to bring out my best abilities and who shared my desires. And we are inextricably linked for the rest of our lives. Those are the same women, some of them who are in my book, some of them whom now I know personally and are friends with. But I think that when you follow this fire formula, you find your people and your power. But something interesting happened when I turned 50 and I stepped back from Moms Demand Action in 2023. And I was listening to a podcast and the podcaster said, if you don't have 5 friends you can call in the middle of the night, you don't have enough close friends. And I thought, well, I have 5 kids, and then he said, and that doesn't include your family. And I thought, well, what is the point of having 5 kids if I can't call them in the middle of the night?
Right. They call you in the middle of the night.
All the time, like for the most bizarre things. But I decided to, as any type A woman would, read up on friendship and how do you make friends and how do you find your people. And the next thing that I did in my life was to create bonfires based on my book. So I talk a lot about these people in your book. And now women are taking the book and they're creating them in real life. And we just partnered with an organization called Red Wine and Blue. And we had a Zoom where over 50 women volunteered to start these bonfires where they live to talk about their personal, political, professional passions. And I've now been to them in Sarasota and Tampa and St. Petersburg. And it's just, I think in a post-polarized, post-social media, post-pandemic world, people are looking to meet their neighbors and to know and understand their community. And a lot of that machinery already exists for men. You can join the Elks Club or, there's all these different sort of local male clubs, but there's not a lot of that in place for women. And given that we live such long lives and often longer lives if we're married to men or partnered with men than they do, right? And so it's really important to have those friendships and those partnerships. And that's your support system. Those are the people who are going to help you figure out what your fire is and help you achieve it and help you grow it and be there for the next one.
Sounds a little bit like book clubs, because somebody has to take the initiative to get it going. And You find a group. And it's amazing. Some book groups last decades and decades and decades.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think what's interesting about women, and I'll give you an example, which is menopause. My mother's generation did not talk about menopause at all. I don't even think they knew what they were going through. And certainly no doctors were there to help them. It was verboten because it was considered disgusting or weird to talk about it with other women. And my generation is like, forget that. Like we have this whole whisper campaign going, like, how do you find estrogen patches? And should I be on testosterone? And how do I weight lift? There's all this information that we didn't get from our moms that we are interested in talking about. And I think these groups are so important to facilitate that, so you don't feel alone.
Well, you do talk about how midlife can be a real catalyst for change.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
I won't use the F word on your podcast, but I will say that like there's, I think what I call the double bind of F's giving, which means women are supposed to give all the F's, right? We have to care about the world and our family and our community and our partners and our parents and our kids. And yet we also have to give 0 F's because there's going to be blowback when you go out in the world, right? Anytime you decide to do things differently, whether you're going to do more or you're going to do less, people are going to have opinions about it. And that is what most women have said to me. I wish I had a handbook to prepare me for all the blowback I would get when I did things differently, when I went out into the world and tried to be brave. And as someone who experienced a huge amount of blowback, which I described to you earlier, right? Like men with guns being dragged out of any event I went to. Hopefully you're not going to experience that, but you might get a snarky comment from your mother-in-law. Someone might say something in the kids' pickup line because you didn't go to a soccer game because you were out figuring out what you wanted to do.
Right.
And I just think it's so important for women to be prepared. Like you're going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. People are going to trigger your guilt and shame, and you're going to have to do it anyway. And it is also like a muscle. Everything is sort of this idea of a practice, and you're going to just have to keep trying to do it over and over again until you don't feel those feelings and decide you don't want to do that thing. I meet so many brilliant women who have amazing ideas, but they don't feel like they can get started until they've crossed every T and dotted every I. If I had done that, I still wouldn't have started Moms Demand Action. I still don't know everything there is to know about gun violence or organizing or the legislative process. But the point is to take those first initial baby steps.
Yeah. Do you think developing the thicker skin that you need to deal with blowback is something that's harder to do in midlife, or maybe it's easier?
I think it's easier. And there's actually an interesting study that came out and said when you start to lose testosterone and estrogen, you're not as emotionally involved and you're not as attached to what people think about you. And so therefore you can kind of do it more bravely. And I have definitely experienced that in my life. The things that I would tolerate or put up with or, people pleasing or worried about what people thought, I don't really care anymore. I know I only have a finite amount of time left. It certainly doesn't feel as endless as it did in my 30s and 20s.
You don't have any F's left to give, as I say.
I know F's left.
When you were talking before about having to wait and cross all the T's and make sure you're absolutely ready to do something, as you probably know, there's a lot of studies that show in terms of employment, men will go for jobs for which they have very few qualifications at very young ages and often get them. And women with far more qualifications won't apply because they're like, well, I don't check all of the 30 boxes that they're asking for. And this reinforces the problem.
Yes.
Right, as you go along. So Elsevier is an education company, and we're always looking to fill knowledge gaps. Is there a topic you think we should make a video about or some other educational content about that you feel deserves more attention?
Yeah, I think menopause is one. I think weightlifting is another. We aren't told as women until, at least these days, until it's almost too late and you go get a DEXA scan that you need to be lifting weights your whole life in order to be healthy and strong all the way until the end of your life. And I think women are often intimidated by, going to the gym. I know I am. And so I love that idea. And I think specifically hormone replacement therapy, that there's just so much misinformation and misunderstanding about the benefits and the potential risks.
Great suggestions. Thank you for those. So as we wrap up here, another question we'd love to ask our guests is to provide some advice to the students and early career professionals in our audience about approaching their careers. You've offered a lot of great advice so far, but there are other things you would leave them with.
Yes. First is laying the groundwork of figuring out your values, abilities, and desires. There are thousands of values. Brene Brown is sort of the North Star of values. If you want to see what all the values are, you can get one of her books. But figure out what are the values where you are in your life right now, understanding they will change eventually. What are your desires? So ask yourself, what do I want? Think about what you really enjoyed as a kid. What will you be sad if you don't accomplish by the end of your life? That can inform your desires. And then what I think is really interesting is this idea of what are my abilities? And I see in particular with women, as you mentioned, like the who applies for what job, women so often downplay their abilities. And I coach a lot of women, and what they often say to me is, well, who wants to hear from me? Who wants to hear what I have to say? And it's because you have so many abilities you don't realize. There's an exercise I go through with women and in the book where I say, I want you to list all of your abilities. That includes even if you threw a kick-ass kid's birthday party, because that is a lot of executive functioning, right? What are all your abilities? But then here's the tricky part. You have to take it to your family and friends and ask them what they see your abilities are. So the value of this list is it's there to remind you constantly that you should apply for that job, or you should start that organization, or you should ask for that promotion. But the other piece of it is it tells you what abilities you're missing. We always think that, if I don't have this innately, then I'm not up to the task, but that's not true. You can go get so many of these abilities. You can acquire them. And if there's something that's really important to you that you want, then start taking those steps toward acquiring those abilities so you can get to the place you are. But I think the most important thing is taking that first step. And I tell the story in my book of Jessica Yellen, who has just created this amazing platform called News Not Noise. She was the first person to do news on Instagram. And it was before people were doing that at all. And she was the CNN White House correspondent. She was more than qualified. And yet she was too nervous to make this first video about, I think it was during Supreme Court hearings for a justice. And finally, one of her friends said, I'm not leaving your house today until you go out and you film a synopsis of what's going on in your backyard. And she did it. And it was very imperfect. In fact, people thought she was in Cuba because she had palm trees in her backyard. And she eventually deleted it and took it down and did another one. But the point is, it was a starting place, even as if it was imperfect. And it was what helped her start to perfect it and do it more and get comfortable with it. If you don't take that first baby step and you're just always thinking about it and, I've got to be perfect, I got to be totally ready. No, you have to build the plane as you fly it.
That's a great practical framework for folks to be thinking about. And you'll get more of that sort of advice in Shannon Watts' most recent book, Fired Up, which explores how women can harness their ambition at any stage of life. And with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Michael Carrese. Thanks for checking out today's show. And remember to do your part to raise the line and strengthen the healthcare system. We're all in this together.
If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes at osmosis.org/raisethelines podcast.